Hey everybody, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Essentially what we're going to be doing is trying to do an online version of what we have in class. So what I'm going to walk us through is something that looks like this, which will be our whiteboard that we'll go through, and I'll try to keep this as close to the in-class lectures as possible. So hopefully this will get refined as we move forward, but let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to be taking a look at reality and being on chapter 3. So basically what I was thinking with this as far as going through this is you could play and pause as it comes up. And essentially what we want to be doing is trying to maintain like an active engagement with this. So a few spots where you could stop and ask and answer questions for yourself. But essentially I'm going to be going through this and I'll have kind of three main questions at the end that will turn into this week's or next week's reading reflection. Okay, so so far today, what I wanted to take a look at was reality and being. So take a look at this, chapter 3, reality and being. So basically what we've looked at so far, we've looked at two major questions in philosophy is what it means to be human or human nature, and also what is philosophy. So this has often resulted in several times getting to the question of what is being. We talked about this a little bit last week. You know, that being is something that we'll go into a little bit more detail later. But our ongoing question for our class has been between being and becoming. And kind of whatever our instinct has been for, have we felt like we are something that is static and stays still, or do we feel like there's something that is becoming and we're constantly changing? So there's a few frameworks we'll take a look at that kind of either veer towards one or the other of these, and that affects how we understand reality. So by the end of it, I'll go through the three main ones, and then ask you all to kind of figure out which one you think you most identify with. Okay, so this week in general, we're looking more deeply into the concept of ontology, which, as we talked about last week, was something that basically looks at the idea of being itself. It's a study of what it is to be, what the nature of being human is, and basically the official definition, how we understand ourselves and our relationship with time and space. So from this, we had a discussion where we talked about the difference between Descartes' assertion of I think, therefore I am, versus Buber's idea, through the thou, a person becomes an I. And essentially what we got at here is that Descartes' idea, I think, therefore I am, is something that relationships, they don't necessarily need to have anyone else involved. This idea that Descartes only requires the individual, sort of like an atom, that as an atom, you don't necessarily need anyone else in society, you just need yourself. And that's all you really need to understand yourself, because his whole thing was, I am a thinking being. We go further and further down that line. All I really can know about myself is that I'm a thinking being. Well, Buber is taking a slightly different look at that. He's thinking more about self and being as necessarily including the other. Meaning that a person literally cannot become themselves without the other. We talked a little bit about this too, just all the people that influence us in life, the journey we take as we grow up, all these things influence who we become. And literally, we can't understand ourselves without having that experience growing up. And some of us came up with some of the examples of folks that were maybe abandoned. And I think there was an example from the reading. People being abandoned in the forest or something and growing up without social interaction, and the big effects that had on people. And literally they didn't have the ability to learn language or had difficulty interacting in society. So a central question that comes out of these two, whether you identify with one or the other, is what do we think is real? So reality is going to look a little bit different depending on which of these perspectives you actually take, and how you feel about these. So the introduction of the chapter provides an interesting idea of us taking a look at what is real. And essentially they go this whole thing about arguing between us thinking things and us experiencing things, and whether or not that has actual material reality. So to make that more clear, the example that the book gives is talking about the idea of, as children or as youth, maybe being afraid of the quote unquote monster under the bed, where we're afraid of something that we think is living under the bed or living in our closets, afraid of the dark, these actual fears. We actually feel the fear. The fear is real, but it's not necessarily relating to something that's material. So the difference between real material, the physical, can be touched or felt, but it may actually inspire real fear. So the ability then for us to have felt consequences for something that's not material or real becomes a bit of a question for us to take a look at. So how do we grapple with those two things? What's the nature of what is real if fake things, such as monsters, can actually have real effects on us, right? So I guess the essential question then, and if you want to pause here and think about this for a moment, is what do you think about this? How do we grapple with something that may or may not be real, like a monster under the bed, but that we may have real fear over? Is this real? So is something real if it has felt consequences? What do we think about that? So, of course, philosophers have come up with several ways to determine reality. So, faced with this question of how do we have subjective or felt things that have real consequences, and how do we grapple with that and help determine reality? So, there's several ways to find or determine reality. So, one of the main things is inductive versus deductive reasoning. So, both of these are ways of taking stock of all the information we have and trying to determine whether something is real or not real, or true or not true. So inductive reasoning is just simply using observations of the world to make conclusions. And generally you're finding a pattern here. So one of the examples they give is where there is smoke, there is fire. So every time you see fire, you also see smoke, you might relate the two. So if you see smoke from far away, but you don't actually see the flames, we don't actually see the fire, we could actually start concluding that maybe there is a fire there because we see the smoke. So it's building up associations with each other. Well, deductive is kind of the opposite, starts on the opposite end. It takes general principles and starts making a generalization about it. So you take several things put together, and given all these bits or premises, ideas, you come to a new conclusion. So here's one of them that we have here. So one premise or one bit of information is all men are mortal. The second one is Socrates is a man. So therefore, Socrates is immortal, because these two things coincide with each other. So it's using logic, but two different premises or ideas to come up with a conclusion. So this is one way that we try to get at reality. So since we can't know for sure how we separate ideas from physical things or real things, then maybe we have to build it up on ideas. So here's a method of figuring it out. So, of course, another way to do this, we've talked a bit about, is materialism and the scientific method. So we talked a bit about materialism, and we've been talking about them several times now. The materials framework, and if we remember this, basically that materialists believe that everything is made of matter or physical things that can be touched. So they try to avoid this whole thing. Unlike Descartes, this I think, therefore I am, they don't worry so much about what we're thinking is or what the soul is, rather that everything should be able to be measured, everything should be able to be thought about or actually thought about directly. So everything has to be material or physical. Therefore, questions of the idea in mind are nonsensical to them. So basically then, materials have their way of getting at reality. It's basically just narrowed to a set of self-contained observations that we can make true observations about. And if we think about this, it's just like the scientific method that maybe we picked up in science class. It's not necessarily about making big grand claims, but it's making smaller claims. So in a science experiment, you'll follow along a few set of direct observations, like watching a water heat up. Like if you have a beaker, you're heating it up under the fire. So you notice that adding fire to water, the heat makes it bubble and boil. And if you put your hand over the steam, it feels hot. So this idea then that through a few small bits of direct information, we're able to directly observe the sensation of heat or creation of heat, through fire. So in any science experiment, it's going to have to be reduced to those smaller bits. So smaller bits of small truths or small ideas to kind of get to larger truths or reality. So it's in essence then, the scientific method would become like the gold standard for materialists to look at this. So scientific method uses observations to come to a conclusion about one small aspect of our world. And then maybe, as above, maybe with all these bits of information, we could start doing deductive or inductive logic, reasoning, to start figuring out what the world actually looks like. So for a materialist, the big questions of reality, like how I experience the world, has little value if we can't actually measure it. So then, for a materialist, you might ask the question then, what might be the advantages or disadvantages of the materialist scientific approach? For instance, what kind of questions could you ask from this perspective? So what would be the main questions you would ask from this perspective? Which ones wouldn't make sense? And what effect does this have on the world of the individual? So this might be one of the questions you want to take a look at below. I'll reproduce this later. But just trying to think about from this perspective, because it starts framing how you ask questions, what questions could you ask? Would they have to be from a scientific lens? Could you ask questions about the soul? Would this make sense from this perspective? And then what effect does this have on the world of the individual if you're actually to take these seriously, right? So then going back over here, there are, of course, some objections to materialism. So if that doesn't sit well with you, there's another view called Idealism, which sort of takes the opposite approach. So, of course, philosophers always tend to disagree with each other, and here's one of the other approaches. It gets to reality. So objection number one, one of the main objections is that rather than having faith in our senses, like being able to feel and touch the world, from this perspective, can we really reduce everything simply down to a set of chemical reactions or physical things? Can things like thought or imagination, I think we talked about this and what makes us human, like for instance, robots aren't necessarily human because they don't have this ability to imagine. So if we can imagine things, then how does that fit within this material framework? So an example of this would be being able to imagine something that doesn't exist. So I, in my mind, can imagine a unicorn, for instance. And from a materials perspective, how do we explain this? Because I don't have any real sensation of seeing a unicorn in the world. Rather, a unicorn is something that's sort of false and doesn't actually exist, only in the mind. So experiences of the imagination, experiences of the soul or mind, or thought in general, how are these explained from that perspective? So the idealist, rather than the materialist, takes these objections rather seriously and claims that reality is essentially composed of minds and ideas rather than their matter. So go ahead and read this example, page 163. This is a helpful one to take a look at. We pause here and take a look at that. So essentially from this perspective then, nothing can be reach ourselves, our mind, our soul, without being first brought in through our senses. And senses in this case are our ideas or our feelings in the world rather than what we physically touch. So sensations rather than actual physical senses like smell or touch. It's the sensation of that, right? So, so the implications of this then. So some examples might be helpful here. So one of the main ones is the ethical implications of this. So from this perspective, idealism emphasizes the spiritual or the moral aspects of the self. So one of the guys that's taking a look at this is Berkeley. He argued that we are nothing but our perceptions of things, that at essence, we only get sensations or impressions of the external world. So only impressions or sensations. We don't actually sense the external world, it's only a sensation of it, okay? So not only do we not actually get direct access to it, but these are interpreted through our mind or our soul, and are therefore our morality. So you see several layers here. So he's saying not only do we not actually have access to the external world, we're not actually touching the world. So it's going through our sensations of that, our impression of what it is to feel, what it is to smell, what it is to hear. But also these are cycled through a second layer down here of interpretations through our mind, through our soul, and our morality. So basically then, not only are they not directly experienced, but we interpret these through our experiences of life, our religious upbringing, our values as we got as kids. And therefore, everything becomes like a moral question. So that's what we're saying down here. Consequently, every decision we make is at its roots a moral one. We are essentially moral creatures that interact with the world in ethical terms. So kind of as a profound difference between the other two, whereas the materialist isn't interested in these questions. The idealist rather says these are the only questions that matter. That everything is ethical and moral because everything we do matters. So, in pausing here even, how does this strike you? You know, if we were to trust our gut, which I think is important in a lot of these philosophical ideas, if we were to trust our gut, how does this strike you? If everything were filtered through our mind and soul, does this make us more ethical? Do you see problems with this? Do you see objections with this? Do you like this way? Maybe you don't necessarily think this is the only way of doing it, but is this something that makes sense to you? Or would this make a better world? What do you think of this? And of course, then, so you may be asking yourself here, so beginning our objections, all philosophers have objections to things. But so you may be asking yourself then too, if we think of everything as just ideas, might have this problem of something like anything goes, right? Meaning that from this subjective perspective, if everything is what we think it is, then anything is possible, right? For example, if I think that I'm a millionaire, and then I would be, because I just imagine it, right? That in this case, if you think of it just like that, our reality, our lived experience would have no control from the outside world. It'd only be our perception of it, right? So Berkeley addresses this to an extent, maybe not to a satisfaction of everybody, but he comes up with two different ideas of idealism. One is the subjective and one is the objective. So from the subjective, it's exactly that. This is our kind of our who we are idealism, our soul, our mind, our imagination, kind of where we just imagine the outside world and we're not necessarily constrained by reality, so to speak. So reality itself is something that we're not constrained by. This is where unicorns and dragons can exist. This is where anything can happen. However, there's a second layer, and they happen at the same time, but they are separate but related, is the objective. These ideas come from experiences and senses from the world. So therefore, these things are just our sensations of how things feel, the heat from the sun, the sensation of lightness and darkness, and how we build those things up in understanding our world. So for instance, when we see the sun come up, we start associating that with time and day. When we see the sun go down, that's nighttime, and we do different things. We go to sleep or we wake up. And so our world starts to look a bit like our objective ideas that come from us in the world. And of course, these two interact with each other. They're not separate. But at least with a little bit of the objective in here, it modifies our ability to just do whatever we want, or the anything goes question, and rather our subjectivity is constrained to an extent by our experiences in the world. So it changes what is possible and therefore modifies it a little bit. So there are of course some further objections, and we'll just briefly cover these here, and including ones that you might be feeling. So one of the main ones is anthropomorphism, just a fancy word for basically saying applying the human perspective to everything. So if we make everything subjective, the argument goes, then we're projecting ourselves or human values onto the world. So what might end up happening is, if we start seeing humanness everywhere, we start mistaking our abilities to change things. And we see that everywhere. So we might start giving human feelings to animals or human feelings to nature, like Mother Nature is angry, or earthquakes are a cause of human wrongdoing. Just these different things where we start seeing natural phenomena and seeing them all as related to human action. So if we start seeing the world through this lens, not only is everything moral, but everything is necessarily human and controlled by us. So that's one of the main arguments then. So as we see here, and what I'm about to go to now briefly is a split. So the idealists and the materialists took on two major questions, and were challenging each other. As one is seeing things as just ideas, the idealists, and the other is seeing things just as material, the materialists. And so there's been modifications with that, where people take a little bit of both or avoid the question altogether. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover this split between pragmatism, positivism, and a little bit further down, there's something called anti-realism. So basically, try to pay attention to these three, just to be a brief coverage of these three. And what I'm going to want you to do later is to take one of these three and write a little bit more about it, like which one makes the most sense to you, and argue why it makes the most sense, and try to connect it to your own personal philosophy, the project we've been looking at so far. So I'm going to give you these three outlines, and then you could go into more depth and look at the different people talking about it in the book itself. Okay, so here's the split. So the pragmatist is coming out of both the materialist and idealist perspectives and is changing the question a little bit. So pragmatism, and here I would call it practicalism, it's essentially taking the idea and kind of ignoring the problems of mind and body that we've been talking about and reality, and just saying, let's not worry about that so much, not to get too intellectual or too academic about these things, and instead let's look into the reality of things. And reality is in consequences of things. So they're not really interested in whether or not something is real in the sense of the pragmatists, or in the sense of the materialists or idealists. They're more interested in how these concepts affect our real lives. So for someone like Dewey, and he puts this pretty succinctly, basically that philosophy shouldn't be dealing with intellectual questions like, is there reality? He doesn't care too much about that. He's more interested in questions of morality and justice. Rather, we shouldn't be arguing about if there actually is a table that I have my laptop on, or is there actually a pen in my hand. These things don't matter. What the consequence should be is, should we, political questions, should we be fighting for democracy? Should we have equal rights? And less interested in the metaphysical questions of reality. So basically then, the method then of what happens from this perspective is, rather than taking a look at logical things like inductive or deductive reasoning, the scientific method, the method should be the study of consequences of our choices and experiences. So like I said, it's a practical approach to philosophy. Let's not worry about these metaphysical things. It's sort of a waste of time. And actually real people could be getting hurt if we don't have actual practical questions. So that was their approach. So that if that is something you're interested in, maybe take a look at that one, if that speaks to you in some way. And the other approach then is the positivist approach. They also kind of wanted to get rid of those unpractical questions of whether things are real or not. Rather than saying they're not practical, they literally said that questions about whether things are real or not are just nonsense. Like, it's ridiculous for us to be asking these questions because you can't really measure these things. You can't, and the idea down here, a subjective idea, so my feeling of something or my belief of something, how that relates to subjective experiences, neither one of these can be measured. It's all just nonsense because it all takes place essentially in the mind, or something that can't be measured. So kind of like the materialists, they prefer to have really objective questions of the world, that philosophy should not be looking at things of metaphysical nature because they just don't make any sense at all. Like if you want to do that on your free time, go for it. But the real thing is going to be the measurable aspects of the world. So they're going to like science. They're going to like looking at practical approaches of things that ask questions that can be answered. They don't want to have these open-ended questions. And so therefore, with this one, I kind of make it as scientism. This is the kind of putting science as your overall philosophy of the world and your access to how things are and how you view things. So positivism is scientism. Okay, so these are the two approaches. These are both responses to the impracticality of the questions before. And one of the more modern approaches, and I'll briefly touch on this one because I think it's relevant to our question of being versus becoming, is this question of anti-realism. So they are also looking at these questions, but they would take a different approach. So anti-realism is a response to both of these groups, and they don't really land on either end of it. Okay, so they say there's too much focus on either with the positivists, the hyper-material questions of they're not interested in metaphysical, let's just look at how we can objectively see reality, or just the hyper-practical, like the pragmatists. So what they're saying then is that in reality, in our reality, is we no longer have one reality. We have realities. And this is kind of a consequence of a world of increasing diversity. There's globalization, there's multiple communities working together, multiple cultures working together, multiple intersections. And especially with the rapid expansion of technology and social media, that having a reality is unstable. There's more and more, our realities are more unstable. It's more in flux and more moving. So essentially then, they say our reality is too much influenced by all these things to actually say that there's one type. So it largely depends on how we feel, see, and perceive the world and think about the world. This actually shapes who we are, constantly shifting. So, for example, then, so a discussion of how art, thought, and experience each affect each individual differently. That we are active artists or constructionists of our world. So if you think about the different circles interlocking with each other, each of these things could be something different. Like, so this one could be your family experience. This one could be your a moral experience, like with church. This one could be schooling. And that all these things affect each person differently. And maybe we are this little spot in the middle. This is who we are in the middle. But because all these things are constantly shifting and the shifts over time and modifies, that we end up with different realities constantly adjusting. So this one could shift into something completely new. And this could happen moment to moment. So we put together a variety of thoughts, languages, social experiences, obstacles we had growing up, and dreams. And these are constantly shaping and reshaping our world. So basically saying that if you go try to be too practical with things, like the pragmatists, that you can't really practically dismiss these things because our perception of how the consequences affect our lives are constantly shifting because we're different people even from minute to minute, but at the very least from year to year, you know. And similarly with the positivists who want to look at everything through science and ignore how we feel about things, so you can't do that. You can't actually have an objective view of the world because everything is constantly shifting. You can't just have a science view because your upbringing or your experience that morning, like if you had a bad morning before you went into the science lab, is going to affect how you see the world. So they argue then, moreover, in addition to all these different things, that power itself can shape how we experience the world. So they have something like grand narratives or big stories that we gather in our youth, that these affect us. So these are things from like our country, like patriotism, or religion, family beliefs, big ideas like capitalism or Catholicism or Hinduism. Any of these things shape how we view the world. So stories from all of these places have large effects on how we understand ourselves, our goals, and our reality. So they argue then, as human beings, we can't actually separate these things from ourselves, and that they're always affecting us. So that this idea that we could separate all that, separate our experiences, and actually engage in the world as objective beings is farcical and unrealistic. But they also argue, so it's not that we're completely shaped by these things, that these experiences that we have are, because they're always changing, they can change by our active resistance to these narratives. So we can make different choices within these narratives. So we could question these narratives, change our upbringing, change our views of our upbringing, and the things that our parents or families or schools are telling us. So like the others, they grapple with questions of reality. But unlike the others, they say that this is dynamic, that we are, as I circled up here, being versus becoming, that they definitely are on this end of things. They were constantly becoming, so it's unrealistic to argue, for instance, that we could have any direct access to what is practical or what is scientific in the world. So they move in a different direction. So basically then, if we're to look back at these three things, all these perspectives are looking at reality in a different way. Pragmatists want to see the world as something that is practical questions. Let's not get bogged down in the details. Let's just see what the consequences are. Because we could deal with consequences. We can measure those. Positivists say that the whole idea of what is real and isn't real is nonsense. We should be able to just only care about things that we can actually measure. Otherwise, it's just not worth our time, at least in philosophy. And finally, the anti-realists say that neither one of these can actually be done objectively, that we can engage in these things, but we have to be aware all the time that we're constantly being reinterpreted and we're constantly modifying our reality based on our experiences from our family, our life. We're constantly becoming something different. So what I do then, as we move forward, and I'll put this in the post, is to take a look at these three and see which one you think fits more with your perspective. And this is all from chapter 3, and how you might fit one of these in to your overall my philosophy statement that we started in the very beginning. So go ahead and we'll take a look at those and kind of continue our discussion next week.